All right, guys, today we went over documents D, E, and F. You guys did D for homework, but I talked about it in class today so that we could have some clarification and just analyze this particular document. As I went over it in class today, I went ahead and talked about some words that were within the text that I thought you might have had some difficulty with, and I gave a little bit more explanation as I went along and read the document. So here we go. And then there were the Palestinians who had watched in horror over the past 75 years. As these aliens are foreigners from other countries, first trickled, slowly came, then rapidly came into their homeland, the Arab leader the Arab leader that they are talking about is Mr. Goldman, and he is talking with David Ben-Gurion, who we know is a Jewish citizen because he was the author of our last document, document C. And he confesses to Mr. Goldman that if he were an Arab person, he would understand what was going on, and he too would he would fight a continuous war with Israel. He understands that. Mr. Gordon says, sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Them being the Arabs and us being the Jews. There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, which is a German concentration camp. But was that their fault? When he says there, he's talking about the Arabs. He's saying all of these bad things that happened to the Jews, was it the fault of the Arabs? And no, it wasn't. And so he understands their point of view. He says that the Arabs only see one thing, that the Jews have come in and stolen their country. The first Arabs who left their homes did so on their own, expecting to return once the Jews lost or the fighting stopped. The Jewish mayor, an Arab resident, begged Arab residents to stay. Then, at that time, the head of the Jewish agency political department called the Exodus, and Exodus is a mass leaving of people, dreadful. And he even likened means to link or connect or compare this event, this Exodus, and he compared it to what had happened, befallen, that's what befallen means, happened to the Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe. While Jewish atrocities are really bad, horrible things that are happening, notably the infamous is a famous event that's really bad. So like 9/11, the Holocaust, the Boston bombing, Pearl Harbor, things like that are infamous. The infamous massacre at Dien were very real. Apocalyptic means like a really horrible, big, disastrous world event. That the Arab broadcast induced further flight, meaning because they are broadcasting this information over the news and things like that, it encouraged more and more people to actually leave Palestine. And it showed the people depicted, that's what depicted is, as traitor, those who chose to stay behind. So the broadcasting was calling out people who stayed behind traitors, because here's the dilemma that's going on. Here's the predicament that they're in. Arabs have the decision to make. Should they stay in their country or should they leave like they've been encouraged to do? But once the Palestinian exodus began, Jewish leaders struck by their good fortune. They're like, woohoo, yay, look at us. This is good for us. First encouraged it. So they happily say, hey, yeah, it's cool. Y'all should leave. Go. Then they coerced it, meaning that they kind of forced them into doing something that they didn't really want to do. So we can look at coerce as a forcing. They forced some of the Arabs off their land. And then once that occurred, they sought to make it stick. So they went out of their way to find different ways to make it official that the Arabs couldn't come back. After all, the Israelis needed the space for the people who were fleeing from what happened at the hands of the Nazis. So for the victims of Hitler, as well as those Jews who are fleeing other Arab countries. Matters took another turn in May 1948 when the British left Israel, declared statehood, and the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq marched in. Again, for all their numerical superiority, larger army, The Arabs were ill-equipped, inexperienced, and unprepared. Within 5.5 months, they were crushed militarily and psychologically, mentally. Only King Abdullah of Jordan, with the best British trained army and limited their goals were not to destroy the Jewish state, but to annex means to set free, the West Bank. And they got what he wanted. Meanwhile, Israel grew beyond the partition. Remember the split up of the country of Palestine, now Israel, gained more defensible borders, and by destroying Arab villages, further reduced the Palestinian population. All right. So look at the questions. Let's look at those questions. According to Mr. Marglick, how did the Israeli war impact the Palestinians? Well, it crushed them militarily and psychologically. It also caused them to lose more land, and they were ill-equipped to actually do this. So this is how this affected them. What arguments did Mr. Ben Gordon, a Jewish leader, make that justified the continued control of the Palestinians? He stated that that God promised the land to them, and so he kind of understood why the Palestinians should continue to occupy the land. And he said that if he was them, he would fight too, because their land was stolen. So he understands that even though that God promised this land to the Jews, okay, so I stopped on question 2 because I needed to go back and edit and adjust some things. I didn't really like that answer. So he does state that if he were an Arab too, he would wage perpetual war with Israel, because in the Arabs' eyes, the Jews came in and stole their country. And then number 3, given the circumstances, what was the predicament faced by the Palestinians? Their predicament that they were facing is they could stay on their homeland and fight, or they could leave. And then this document answers the DBQ question by showing us that the Palestinians were kicked off their land or exiled from their land, whether it was voluntarily or by force. And this is very similar to the way that the Jews were dispersed from their land back in ancient Roman times. All right. Document E. This is just a timeline, and it talks about a few things in here. I had the students just go ahead and answer the questions on their own, and then we talked about it. So looking at this timeline, May 15th, the Israeli War for Independence happened. Then on April 3rd, 1949, then armistice, which is kind of like a peace treaty agreement between two sides, and they work out some type of deal of what each side is going to get. So in 1949, Israel is going to gain about 50% more territory than they originally had under the partition plan that the UN put in place. October the 29th, 1956, there was the Suez Crisis, which is where Egypt's president, he is going to take control of the Suez Canal from the British and French control, and then Israel is going to invade the Sinai Peninsula, and they're going to occupy it for just a few months. And they're going to do that with the help of the French and the British. May 1964, the PLO, or the Palestine Liberation Organization, is founded, started, created, and they created with the aim of destroying Israel. May of 1967, the Egyptian president closes the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping and dismisses the UN peacekeeping forces, telling them to get out, and negotiations with the U.S. to reopen the Straits of the Tiran fail. And then between June 5th and the 10th, the 6-day war occurs, where Israel destroys the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. They conquer and occupy the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, and then they conquer the West Bank from Jordan and the Golan Heights from Syria. But then on October the 6th, 1973, on the day of Yom Kippur, they call it the Yom Kippur War or the October War, the Arabs do a surprise attack on the Jews on their holiday, which is a holiday for atonement, which is very shocking for them because they weren't prepared for it. I mean, who would be when they're celebrating a holiday? During this particular attack, Egypt was able to retake the Suez Canal and then a narrow zone on the other side. Syria is going to reconquer the Golan Heights. And then following massive U.S. and Soviet resupplying of the sides, Israel succeeded in pushing back the Syrians and then threatening Damascus. And then in the Sinai, the IDF is going to cross the Suez Canal and cut off the Egyptian and Third Army. And then on March 26, 1979, a peace treaty is signed between Egypt and Israel. This is the Camp David Accords that was helped by President Carter, but we know that that doesn't really end up helping much in the end. All right, now onto the questions. Based on the timeline above, how did the Arab-Israeli War impact Israel? Well, they're going to gain about 50% more land than they originally had under the UN allotment. 2, the PLO is the group that was formed, and their aim was to destroy Israel. 3, it was a surprise attack on a Jewish holiday of atonement, Yom Kippur, and the Jews were not ready for an attack, and so that's how they were managed to be so successful that day. And then how does this question answer the DBQ question? How does this document answer the DBQ question? The fighting back and forth because one group does something to the other group, and this shows how conflict is ongoing between the two groups. So these are documents D and E, and now let's move on to F. All right. Document F is nothing more than maps showing us how Palestine is going to lose land over a span of time from 1946 to 2012. And by losing that land, how it displaces so many people. And so 4.7 million Palestinians are going to be labeled as refugees by the UN, and refugee is a person who seeks sanctuary or help or assistance in another country because their country is no longer safe for them to be in. And so looking at the map of 1946, we see that based on the green area, which is Palestinian land, that they had the majority of the land, like over 90% of the land is Palestinian, and only about 10% is Jewish land. But then 1 year later, we see the UN come and do their partitioning, and we see that it goes for more like 60-40, and 60% of the land being in favor of the Jews and 40% being in favor of the Palestinians, which a lot of people will say isn't fair, especially the Palestinians, because, hey, they've lost a lot of their land. Then by 1967, after wars, as we saw with the timeline in document E, we see that because of the 6-Day War and things like that, Palestine is going to lose even more land because they had all of this. Now they only have this little strip, which is the Gaza Strip, and this is the West Bank. But then again, they're going to fight wars, and more conflict is still breaking out because of land issues. They lose quite a bit more of the West Bank, and a little bit of the Gaza Strip is taken away from them, but now the majority of the land is all Israeli. So let's look at the questions. Based on the document above, how did the Israeli-Palestinian conflict impact Palestinians? While the Palestinians keep losing more and more of their land, and now 4.7 million of their people are refugees. Number 2, taking on the role of a Palestinian. Why would the 1947 UN partition map upset you? Well, let's go back and take a peek at it real quick. Well, this is what it looked like in 1946, and this is what it looks like in 1947. If you were a Palestinian, how would that affect you? Would you be upset? I said I would definitely be upset because it gave away a lot of my land. So yes, I would be upset. Then number 3, taking on the role of a Jew. Would the 1947 map upset you? Explain why. They are giving the land that God promised us in the Old Testament, so I would not be upset, but rather happy because I've gained something, I've not lost anything, so that would make me happy. And how does this document answer the question? It answers the question by showing how land was taken away from one group and given to another, which caused ongoing conflict between these two groups. And that is documents D, E, and F. And that's what we did in class today. All right, have a good one. Bye.